Now that everything's been marked out, it's time to start to cut out our timber joints. So the first thing we are going to cut out is the mortise. Okay, so the mortise is down on the bottom of our leg. What we will be using for this part of this step is a beveled edge chisel. So we have our 25mm beveled edge chisel. We have our 6mm. We have a hold fast bench clamp and our mallet. You need to clamp this to the bench because we don't want it moving around. Okay, so ensure that you clamp that to the bench using the hold fast clamp. You'll notice on the base of that clamp point on our hold fast clamp, it does have these extrusions. Don't clamp that directly onto your timber. You'll end up bruising your timber. Just get a scrap piece and place that over the top of your work so you don't damage your work. Okay, find a spot where you can easily access that mortise and then just firmly tighten that up. Okay? When you're using the chisel, it is extremely important to be safe. The first thing, always chisel. Okay, when you are using the chisel, 2 hands are on the chisel at all times. Now there is one instance where you may have just the one hand on the chisel, and that is when you have a mallet in your other hand. Okay, so you're tapping the chisel with the mallet. You must always chisel away from your body. Never ever turn the chisel and chisel towards yourself. Never ever, and this goes back to the 2 hands on the chisel, hold your work with your hand and chisel that way. Okay, obvious reasons, if you slip, that ends up going into your hand. So always ensure that your work is clamped. Also, never ever chisel in the direction of another student at your workbench. There should be enough space for 4 students at a bench. You don't need to be chiseling near anybody else. Have a look at the chisel so you can see it has, the top of the chisel has our bevels. This is extremely important when we start to cut out our joint. And then you'll see on the bottom, it's nice and flat. The bevels, that bevel side, the top, will always face, when we cut, it always faces on the waist side. Okay, so when you set that up. And I'll explain that a little bit later on. Now, the first thing with cutting out our mortise is we have to score the timber. Now, scoring the timber is just basically telling the timber exactly where you want it to break off. So I have a nice mark already created from the marking gauge, so it just sits in there nicely. Okay, get that right up to the line, and you'll notice how I hold the chisel really close to the blade. It's like when you hold a pencil. You hold a pencil like that, so you have far more control over what you're doing, and you'll need to do the same with your chisel. Don't try to line things up holding it right at the top of the handle, because any little movement that you make moves that blade quite a great deal. So holding nice and close, having full control. Ensure that it's nice and straight and upright, and we're just going to hit it with 2 firm hits. You might not be able to see on the camera, but that's starting to make that cut in the grain. We're going to flip the chisel around and we'll do the opposite line. So right up, and then move to the next one, 2 firm lines. So when we chisel, it should break off on that point, and we want it to be exactly on that line. That's the 6mm, so you won't have any gaps. We then move on to our 6mm beveled edge chisel, and again, making sure that the bevels are on the inside. We're just going to score the top and the bottom of our mortise joint. So lining that up carefully, and this goes across the grain. So a nice firm hit there. With your chisel, always check check your chisels are nice and sharp. If you're using a blunt chisel, okay, it's going to be very difficult. It's actually unsafe. So make sure that you're using a sharp chisel at all times. What I'll do from here, before we start any cuts, I'm going to flip this over and I'm going to do the exact same on the opposite side. Okay, and what we actually do is we chisel out from both of the outsides and we meet in the middle. That way you avoid any of your timber blowing out from one of the sides. So again, 25 mil. Turn that around. And it should sit in that mark that you've created from the marking gauge. And now we move over to the 6 mil. So just move yourself if you have to, position yourself so that it's easier for you. And then, so the bevel is always on the waist side, the flat side is on the outside of that. Now what we do, to start to chisel this out, there is a process. So you always chisel from the middle of the mortise and you go to the outside. Okay, and that is so that we don't damage these shoulders on the end of our mortise and have a big hole or a crater in our timber. The way that you hold the chisel is extremely important as well. Like I said before, that bevel stays on the bottom. Don't ever, when we start to chisel, have the bevel on the top. What that will end up doing is pushing the chisel down, it will dive down and you have very little control over how much material you take off. You need to take off small amounts and you need to have control over what you're doing. That way you have a nice clean cut. So holding the chisel in the palm of my hand like so, that's how I hold it. I usually like to have some space where I can rest my arm. Now, because I can rest my arm there, I keep everything nice and steady. If you're up here, your arm's not resting on anything, it tends to shake and you don't have as much control over what you're doing. So let's start here from the midpoint, and you can just see that I'm gently tapping that. And I'm not taking too much off, just taking a nice slither off. Okay, and that there, you can see that. That's how much I'm taking off each time. We'll go again. So I always chisel, also position yourself. I'm right-handed, so I'm going to hold the mallet in my right hand. I'm holding the chisel in my left hand. I'm always chiseling across my body. Okay, don't try to chisel away from your body like that, or obviously not towards your body, or not across like this way. I see people do that all the time, and it's going to make chiseling that out a lot harder for you. I've done this side, so what I'm actually going to do is, because I'm right-handed, I'll flip this around, and this is where you have to think about how this gets clamped up. So clamp it in like so. And now I will chisel this side here, this half of our mortise. So in here, nice gentle taps. Now, if you feel like you're taking too much material off, okay, so that's the chip that I've cut off there. If you're taking too much material off, right, all you have to do is drop the angle of the chisel, okay, and that will start to take less material off. And vice versa, if you are not taking enough material off, you want to take more, just lift the angle of the chisel and it will dive deeper into the timber. Now that I've done my first layer, that's about 1.5 mil depth, I'm going to score the timber again, and this is a really important part. Every time you take a layer off in your mortise, to cut your mortise out, you need to score the timber again. So I'll do that just quickly. So if we go here, and again this way. This is telling the timber where you want it to break off. So let's do another little slither off here. The chisel's sitting in there, it's nice and square. Gently tapping that. Okay, and I might take another little bit off. Not trying to take too much off. This is not a race. And we'll swing this around and do the opposite side. I understand this is a process here, but you will end up with a nicer joint. Okay, and we'll do this once more. I'll score the timber once more, and I'll take one more layer off before we flip this leg over and we start to chisel from the opposite side. So score it across the grain as well. And here, resting my arm so I have a nice steady hand. And we go on the other side as well. And finally, before I flip this over, I will score the timber once more. The timber, we're using pine, it's not the most, it's not the best timber out there. And what it does, it always breaks off at the weakest point in the grain. So you have to be very deliberate telling the timber where you want it to break off. That's the first part there. So you can see I've gone about 1/3 of the depth for that mortise. Let's flip this over. And we'll start to chisel from the opposite side now. I've already scored this side, so we're going from the center. Be careful not to cut out the shoulder of your mortise. And you'll notice how gently I'm tapping that. You don't need to belt the timber. If you have a nice sharp chisel, that should cut through that pine relatively easy. Let's go this side now. And one more. Okay. Let's score this again. So I've gone one layer, making sure that that chisel is hard up alongside the shoulder of the mortise, the outside of your mortise joint. If not, it won't remain 6 mil in that gap. And we'll go this way. Let's go again. Turn this around. There's a lot of repositioning your timber. That takes time, but it is far better to just reposition your work than to try and fix it down the track. So you want to take your time. It's not a race. Okay, I've gone deep enough now that I can score the timber once more. I'm almost 1/3 of the way through this. And again, scoring with almost gone through. So if I go now all the way through, we can now put this, I might just clamp it up and go from the opposite side first. Chisel this last little bit out. It's actually just floating in there. again. Okay, so that's all come out now, and without really having to do any paring at this stage, you'll see that's a relatively neat cut. We haven't blown out any of our timber along the outside of our mortise. We have nice neat shoulders. There's no bruising caused from levering the chisel. We want to avoid that, okay? So what you'll have to do is repeat that process for both of frame A legs and then for the legs of frame B as well.